Nobody could explain why Ranger lost his mind every time the ferry entered the fog. Not because Ranger was an ordinary dog. He wasn't. For 7 years, Ranger had been one of the most reliable search and rescue dogs in Oregon. He had tracked missing hikers through mountain storms, located injured campers buried under fallen timber, and helped save people who would never have made it home otherwise. Nothing scared him. Not helicopters, not gunshots, not thunderstorms, not wild animals. But whenever the old ferry crossed a fog-covered lake in southern Oregon, the 80-pound German Shepherd would begin trembling so violently that grown men became uncomfortable watching him. Then came the day he nearly jumped into the freezing water. And what investigators eventually discovered beneath that lake would force an entire town to confront a secret that had been hidden for nearly 20 years. The story began in a place called Crescent Lake. Most people outside Oregon had never heard of it. Tucked deep within the Cascade Mountains, surrounded by dense pine forests and volcanic ridges, Crescent Lake looked like the kind of place that belonged on a postcard. In summer, fishermen filled the marinas. In autumn, the forests exploded with gold and orange colors. And during winter, snow covered everything in silence. The lake itself stretched for miles beneath the shadow of towering evergreens. Beautiful, peaceful, at least on the surface. 38-year-old Ethan Mercer had lived there most of his life. A former Army medic, Ethan now worked with the Klamath County Search and Rescue Unit. People trusted him. He was calm under pressure, practical, and rarely believed in rumors. His partner was Ranger. The two were practically inseparable. Ethan often joked that Ranger understood him better than most humans. The dog had been assigned to him as a young trainee years earlier, and together they had become one of the most respected SAR teams in the region. If Ranger reacted to something, Ethan paid attention, which was why the first incident bothered him so much. It happened on an unusually cold morning in late October. A thick blanket of fog covered Crescent Lake. The visibility was terrible. You couldn't see more than 20 yards across the water. Ethan and Ranger were taking the ferry from one side of the lake to the other to assist in a search for an elderly fisherman who had failed to return home. The ferry itself was old but dependable. Locals had used it for decades. It saved nearly an hour of driving around the lake. As passengers loaded aboard, Ranger seemed perfectly normal, relaxed, focused, alert. Then the ferry pulled away from the dock, and everything changed. The moment the boat entered the wall of fog, Ranger froze. His ears snapped upright. Every muscle in his body tightened. Ethan immediately noticed. "Easy, buddy." Ranger didn't respond. His eyes locked onto the water, not the shoreline, not the passengers, the water. Then a low growl escaped his throat. Ethan had never heard that sound before. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It sounded almost like panic. Several passengers turned toward them. Ranger stood completely rigid, staring into the fog, watching something nobody else could see. The growling became louder. Then the dog started shaking, not slightly, violently. Ethan knelt beside him. "Ranger, nothing." The dog wouldn't break eye contact with the water. For the entire crossing, he remained locked in that strange state. And the second the ferry emerged from the fog on the opposite side, Ranger suddenly relaxed, just like that, as if nothing had happened. The growling stopped. The trembling vanished. He became normal again. At first, Ethan dismissed it. Dogs were sensitive. Maybe Ranger had smelled wildlife. Maybe there was something in the water. Maybe it was nothing. But 2 days later, it happened again. Same ferry, same lake, same fog, same reaction. This time, the dog began whining before they even entered the thickest part of the mist. Almost like he knew what was coming, the ferry captain noticed. A 60-year-old local named Wade Holloway. "You ever seen him do that before?" Wade asked. Ethan shook his head. "Never." Wade glanced toward the lake. His expression briefly changed. Just for a second. Then he looked away. "You know how dogs are." But the answer sounded forced. Ethan remembered it. A few days later, another rescue call came in. This time a pair of overdue hikers. Again they needed the ferry. Again fog covered the lake. And again Ranger reacted, only worse. Halfway across, the dog lunged toward the railing. Passengers screamed. Ethan barely managed to grab his harness. Ranger wasn't trying to attack anyone. He was trying to get to the water, desperately. The dog barked furiously at something hidden beyond the fog. A sound echoed across the lake, not loud, not clear, just a distant metallic clang, almost like metal striking metal. The instant Ranger heard it, he went completely insane. Barking, pulling, howling, trying to leap overboard. The ferry crew rushed to help Ethan restrain him. Everyone aboard stared. Nobody understood what was happening, and neither did Ethan. Once again, the behavior stopped as soon as they reached shore. Like someone had flipped a switch. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He reviewed every possibility. Medical issues, hearing problems, stress, training fatigue, nothing fit. Ranger was healthy. Veterinarians confirmed it. His hearing was perfect. His instincts remained sharp. There was no logical explanation, yet the pattern continued. Only during ferry crossings. Only when fog covered the lake. Only in one specific section near the center. Weeks passed. Then Ethan noticed something even stranger. Ranger had begun refusing to approach the ferry docks on foggy mornings. The dog who once charged fearlessly into wilderness rescues now hesitated before stepping onto the loading ramp. And every time he hesitated, he stared toward the same distant area of water, the exact location where his panic always peaked, as if something was there, waiting. Then came the morning that changed everything. A storm system had moved through overnight. Heavy fog blanketed the entire lake. Visibility was the worst Ethan had ever seen. The ferry captain nearly canceled service, but an emergency search call forced them to proceed. Only a handful of passengers boarded, Ethan and Ranger among them. For the first 10 minutes, everything seemed normal. Then Ranger suddenly began barking, not at the water this time, at the ferry captain's cabin. His barking became frantic, urgent, desperate. Passengers turned. Crew members exchanged nervous glances. Ethan followed Ranger's line of sight. The dog wasn't looking at Wade Holloway. He was looking at something hanging inside the cabin window, something Ethan had never noticed before. A faded photograph, old, water-damaged, partially hidden behind paperwork. The second Ethan stepped closer to see it, Wade slammed the curtain shut. And for the first time since this mystery began, the old ferry captain looked genuinely frightened. Then Ranger let out a howl so chilling that every passenger on deck fell silent. Because at that exact moment, deep beneath the fog-covered lake, something large struck the underside of the ferry. Once, hard, and the entire vessel shuddered. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The ferry rocked gently in the cold water. Passengers stared at one another. Someone dropped a coffee cup. A woman near the rear deck gasped. What was that? Nobody answered. The impact had been too deliberate to ignore. It hadn't felt like drifting debris. It hadn't felt like a log. It felt like something had struck the ferry. Hard. Ranger erupted into another fit of barking. The German Shepherd lunged against his harness with so much force that Ethan nearly lost his grip. The dog was focused on the water beside the vessel. His eyes were wild, desperate, almost pleading. Ethan rushed to the railing and looked down. All he could see was black water, fog, and his own reflection. Nothing else. The lake revealed nothing. The passengers began talking over each other. Questions, speculation, fear. Meanwhile, Wade Holloway stood frozen inside the captain's cabin. His face had gone pale. Not surprised, not confused. Pale, like a man who had just seen something he hoped never to see again. Ethan noticed it immediately. Years of rescue work had taught him how to read people under stress. Wade wasn't reacting like someone wondering what happened. He was reacting like someone who already knew. The ferry completed its crossing without another incident. The moment they reached shore, Ranger's behavior changed again. Calm, focused, professional. It was as if the panic had never happened. But Ethan couldn't forget what he had seen, especially the photograph, and especially Wade's reaction. The search operation that day lasted nearly 9 hours. They eventually found the missing hunter safe inside an abandoned Forest Service cabin. Everyone celebrated, everyone except Ethan. His mind remained fixed on the lake, on the photograph, and on Ranger. That evening, he stopped by the marina. The fog had finally lifted. Sunlight reflected across the water. The lake looked peaceful, innocent. The kind of place where bad things shouldn't happen. Wade was securing ropes along the dock when Ethan approached. "You got a minute?" The older man sighed. "Depends." Ethan leaned against a piling. "What was in that photograph?" Wade's hands stopped moving. "Only briefly," but Ethan noticed. "Just an old picture." "Of what?" "My family." "Then why hide it?" Wade looked away. The silence stretched. Finally, he shrugged. "I don't like strangers looking at personal things." It sounded reasonable, except Ethan knew it wasn't true. Wade had photographs displayed throughout the Ferry office. Fishing pictures, family vacations, old newspaper clippings. He wasn't a private man. Not normally. Something about that specific photograph mattered. Unfortunately, Ethan had no proof, and no reason to push further, at least not yet. The next week brought more fog, and more incidents. Word began spreading throughout Crescent Lake. People talked. Small towns always did. The ferry dog, the rescue dog that lost his mind on the water. Passengers began recognizing Ranger. Some intentionally boarded crossings, just to witness the strange behavior themselves. Most left more confused than before. One retired schoolteacher claimed Ranger was hearing underwater machinery. A fisherman insisted there was a submerged cave releasing unusual sounds. Others suggested military testing, earthquakes, wildlife, even hidden treasure. The theories grew more ridiculous by the day. None explained why the panic occurred only in one area. And none explained why Ranger's reactions kept becoming more intense. Then another witness came forward. Her name was Melissa Grant. She operated a small bait shop near the western shore. One afternoon, she approached Ethan after hearing local rumors. "You know," she said carefully, "your dog isn't the first." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Melissa glanced around before answering. "Animals have acted strange on that lake before." That got his attention. "What kind of animals?" "Dogs, mostly." "How many?" She hesitated. "More than a few." Ethan felt a chill. "When?" Melissa thought for a moment. "Years ago. Maybe 15, 16 years back." "What happened?" "They'd bark toward the center of the lake." "Same location?" "Pretty much." "Only during fog?" Melissa nodded. "Mostly." That was the first truly meaningful clue Ethan had received. Unfortunately, it raised more questions than answers. Why 15 years ago? Why stop? And why was it happening again? That night, Ethan dug through public records, newspaper archives, online databases, county reports, anything connected to Crescent Lake. Hours passed. Nothing. Then shortly after midnight, he found a small article buried deep inside an archived local newspaper. The headline was easy to miss. "Boat accident investigation suspended." The article was nearly 18 years old. According to the report, a privately owned workboat had disappeared on Crescent Lake during heavy fog. 3 men had been aboard. None were ever found. Authorities assumed the vessel sank. The case eventually went cold. Ethan read the article twice, then 3 times. Something bothered him. The date, 18 years ago, almost exactly matching Melissa's timeline. His pulse quickened. Could Ranger somehow be reacting to something connected to the accident? It sounded impossible. Yet it was the first lead that made any sense. The following morning, Ethan visited the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Dana Reeves knew him well. She listened patiently while he explained everything. The dog, the ferry, the old accident. The strange reactions. Dana folded her arms. "You think Ranger is detecting something underwater?" "I don't know." "You think the missing boat is still down there?" "Maybe." The sheriff considered it. "If it is, that lake is huge." "I know. And 18 years is a long time." "I know that too." Dana sighed. Still, she leaned back. "I've seen your dog work. So have I. If Ranger keeps reacting to the same spot..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Both understood. A search and rescue dog wasn't magic. But they were trained to detect things humans missed, things hidden, things forgotten. And Ranger had never behaved irrationally before. Never. The sheriff agreed to quietly review old case files. No official investigation. Not yet. Just a look. 3 days later, she called Ethan. Her voice sounded different, serious. "Come to my office." He arrived 20 minutes later. Dana placed a thin folder on her desk. "There's something you should see." Inside were original witness statements from the missing boat case. Most were routine. Weather conditions, search efforts, timelines. Then Ethan reached the final statement. His eyes narrowed. The witness was Wade Holloway, the ferry captain, 18 years earlier. Back when he was much younger, Ethan read every word carefully. According to the report, Wade had been the last known person to see the missing boat before it vanished into the fog. The last person. And somehow nobody in town had ever mentioned it, not once. Ethan looked up.
Dana!
The sheriff nodded slowly. I know. What happened to the investigation? It stalled. Why? No bodies, no wreckage, no evidence. Ethan stared at the file. Something wasn't right. The timing, the photograph, the fear, the lake, the dog's reactions. Pieces were beginning to connect, but not enough. Not yet. 2 mornings later, another fog bank rolled across Crescent Lake, thicker than ever. Ethan boarded the ferry with Ranger. This time intentionally. He wanted answers. Halfway across the lake, Ranger began trembling, then barking, then pulling toward the same section of water. Passengers watched, nervously. Wade avoided eye contact. The ferry moved deeper into the fog. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. And then Ranger suddenly stopped barking. Completely. The silence was worse. Much worse. Because the dog now stood perfectly still, listening. Every hair along his back stood upright. Ethan followed his gaze into the white wall surrounding the ferry. At first he saw nothing. Then a shape emerged, barely visible. Dark, motionless, floating in the fog roughly 50 yards away. Not a boat. Not a boy. Something else. Something large. The passengers noticed it too. Whispers spread across the deck. Nobody could identify what they were seeing. The ferry drifted closer. The shape became clearer. And the instant Wade saw it, he slammed the engine into reverse. The ferry lurched violently. People stumbled. Someone shouted, "What are you doing?" Wade ignored them. His eyes remained locked on the object. Terrified. Absolutely terrified. Then Ethan finally recognized what was floating in the fog, and his blood ran cold. Because the object wasn't debris. It was the bow of an old boat, a boat that should have been at the bottom of the lake for nearly 2 decades. The ferry drifted backward through the fog. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed to know what to say. Every eye remained fixed on the object floating in the water. The bow of the boat looked ancient, weathered, damaged. Its faded paint was barely visible beneath years of exposure and algae stains. But one thing stood out immediately. The vessel wasn't drifting naturally. It was sitting unnaturally high in the water, almost as if only part of it remained. Like the rest was still trapped beneath the lake. Ranger exploded into barking again. Not random barking. Targeted, focused, urgent. He was directing all of his attention toward the wreck. Ethan tightened his grip on the harness. Something was very wrong. Very wrong. The passengers began pulling out phones, taking pictures, recording videos. As the ferry slowly repositioned itself, the fog shifted. For a brief moment, the wreck became clearer, and Ethan noticed something attached to the exposed bow, a length of rusted steel cable. The cable disappeared beneath the surface, down into the darkness below. Then the fog swallowed everything again. Gone. Just like that. The boat vanished back into the white wall surrounding them. Several passengers rushed toward Wade's cabin, demanding answers. The captain refused to speak. His face had become ghostly pale. One man asked the obvious question. "What boat was that?" Wade ignored him. Another passenger asked if it was connected to the old disappearance. Still no answer. By the time the ferry reached shore, rumors were already spreading through town. Within hours, social media exploded. Pictures appeared online. Local news stations began calling, and for the first time in 18 years, people were talking about the missing boat again. That evening, Sheriff Dana Reeves organized a small meeting. Nothing official, just a discussion. Present were Dana, Ethan, a county investigator named Rick Palmer, and 2 retired search volunteers who had worked the original case. The photographs taken by ferry passengers lay spread across the table. Everyone studied them carefully. Rick finally broke the silence. "That's definitely an older vessel." One of the retired volunteers nodded. "Looks close to the description from 18 years ago." Dana looked at Ethan. "Could be coincidence." Ethan didn't answer immediately, because deep down he didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Not after everything Ranger had done. Not after the panic. Not after the exact location. Not after Wade's behavior. The sheriff pointed toward one photograph. What's that cable? Nobody knew, but everyone agreed on one thing. The cable shouldn't have been there. The next morning, authorities launched a preliminary survey. No public announcement. No media access. Just a small patrol boat equipped with sonar. Ethan wasn't officially part of the operation, but Dana allowed him to observe, and Ranger came with him. The moment their boat approached the area, Ranger became restless. Not panicked, focused, like a working dog on a scent trail. The sonar operator began scanning. Minutes passed, nothing. Then suddenly the screen lit up. The operator frowned. That's strange. Dana stepped closer. What? He pointed toward a cluster of shapes beneath the lake floor. Not one object, several. Large objects, resting far below. The sonar image wasn't clear enough for identification, but it revealed something unexpected. There appeared to be multiple metallic structures beneath the sediment, not just a boat. The operator adjusted the settings. The shapes became slightly sharper. Silence filled the cabin, because whatever they were looking at, it wasn't natural. Dana leaned forward. Could those be vehicles? The operator hesitated. Possibly. The answer made everyone uncomfortable. Vehicles didn't belong at the bottom of Crescent Lake, especially several of them. The survey ended with more questions than answers. News of the sonar findings leaked almost immediately. Within days, reporters descended upon the town. Residents began sharing old stories. Rumors resurfaced. Half-forgotten memories returned. And that's when the false leads started appearing. Lots of them. A retired fisherman claimed organized crime had used the lake decades earlier. No evidence. A former marina employee insisted there were hidden tunnels beneath the shoreline. Impossible. Someone else reported seeing mysterious lights on the water at night. Investigation proved they were fishing boats. Every theory sounded dramatic. Every theory fell apart. Meanwhile, Ranger's behavior continued worsening. The dog now reacted before even seeing the ferry, sometimes hours beforehand. On foggy mornings, he paced restlessly, refused food, whined at the door, as though he knew something was approaching. Ethan became increasingly concerned, not because Ranger was afraid, because Ranger seemed desperate. The dog wasn't trying to avoid the lake. He was trying to communicate something nobody understood. 3 days later, a major breakthrough arrived from an unexpected source. A woman named Claire Bennett contacted Sheriff Reeves. Claire had recently moved her elderly father into assisted living. While cleaning his garage, she discovered several boxes filled with old records. Her father had worked maintenance for the ferry company years earlier. One box contained photographs. Hundreds of them. Most were routine. Dock repairs, tourists, boats, lake events. Then Claire found a photograph dated 19 years ago, 1 year before the disappearance. The image showed a group of workers standing beside the ferry. Among them was a younger Wade Holloway, but another detail caught everyone's attention. Parked near the dock behind the group was a flatbed truck. The truck carried a large steel crate. Dana enlarged the image, then enlarged it again. Painted across the side of the crate were 4 faded words. Cascade Recovery Services. Nobody recognized the company. County records revealed almost nothing. The business no longer existed. Its registration had been dissolved years earlier. Yet the photograph bothered Ethan. Something about it felt important. The sheriff decided to dig deeper. What she discovered created another mystery. Cascade Recovery Services had operated for only 3 years. Their official business description listed marine salvage and environmental cleanup. Sounds normal, except there was no record of any cleanup projects on Crescent Lake. None. No contracts, no permits. Nothing. It was as though the company had existed without doing any documented work. Then things became even stranger. One of the company's listed owners had been aboard the missing boat 18 years earlier. One of the 3 men who vanished. The room fell silent when Dana revealed that information. Now the missing boat wasn't just an accident. It was connected to a mysterious company. A company somehow linked to Crescent Lake. A company that seemed to disappear right after the incident. The investigation intensified. Bank records, property records, employment records. Most led nowhere. Dead ends. Missing files, destroyed archives. Yet one detail emerged repeatedly. Cash. Large amounts of cash. Payments that couldn't be explained. Several individuals connected to Cascade Recovery Services had suddenly acquired money shortly before the disappearance. Then Ethan uncovered another clue. Pure accident. He was reviewing historical aerial photographs of the lake when he noticed something unusual. Near the northern shoreline stood an old warehouse. The structure appeared in photographs from 20 years ago, then disappeared completely after the boat incident. No demolition permit existed. No records explained its removal. It simply vanished, like someone wanted it forgotten. Dana arranged a visit to the site. The warehouse was gone. Only cracked concrete foundations remained hidden among trees. The location felt abandoned, silent, remote. Ranger immediately became interested. The dog began sniffing aggressively around the overgrown area, following a trail invisible to everyone else. Then he stopped, frozen. His ears lifted, his body stiffened, exactly the way it did on the ferry. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Ranger, the dog, ignored him. Instead, he moved toward a section of collapsed foundation covered by weeds, then started digging furiously. Within seconds, dirt flew everywhere. The team rushed over. Ranger refused to stop. Something was there. Everyone could see it. Dana grabbed a shovel from the truck. Together they cleared away the soil. A metallic surface appeared beneath the dirt. Then more. Then more. Finally the object emerged. A rusted steel hatch, hidden underground, completely concealed for years. Nobody had expected that. The sheriff carefully brushed away remaining soil. Stamped into the metal were barely visible letters. The words were almost unreadable. Almost, but not quite. And when Dana finally deciphered them, every person standing there exchanged stunned looks. Because the hatch bore the same name that appeared on the mysterious crate in the old photograph. Cascade Recovery Services. The company everyone thought had vanished. The company connected to the missing boat. The company connected to the lake, and now apparently connected to a hidden underground structure nobody knew existed. But the biggest shock came seconds later. As investigators examined the hatch, Ranger suddenly began growling, not at the ground, not at the hatch, at someone standing behind them, someone who had quietly arrived without anyone noticing. Someone watching from the trees. Someone who looked absolutely terrified that they had found it. The person was Wade Holloway. For several seconds nobody spoke. The forest seemed to fall silent around them. Even the wind had stopped. Wade Holloway stood motionless at the edge of the trees. His shoulders were slumped. His face looked exhausted. Not like a man caught committing a crime. More like a man who had spent years carrying a burden he could no longer hold. Ranger continued growling, low, steady, focused entirely on Wade. Sheriff Dana Reeves slowly stepped forward. Wade, the old ferry captain, didn't move. How long have you been following us? Wade looked at the rusted hatch, then at the dog, then back at Dana. Finally he sighed, a long, defeated sigh. Long enough. Nobody liked that answer. Dana's voice hardened. Start talking. Wade rubbed his face. For a moment Ethan thought he might walk away. Instead, the old man stared at the hidden hatch. I prayed nobody would ever find that. The statement immediately changed the atmosphere. Nobody had asked whether he knew about the hatch, yet his answer revealed that he did. Dana crossed her arms. Tell me what it is. Wade looked toward the lake, far beyond the trees, hidden behind the forest. The same lake that had haunted Ranger for months. Then he quietly said 4 words. It wasn't supposed to happen. Nobody knew what he meant. Yet every person standing there felt a knot tighten inside their stomach. Because those were not the words of an innocent witness. Those were the words of someone who had lived with regret. The sheriff escorted Wade to her office. No handcuffs. No arrest. Just questions. Lots of questions. The interview lasted nearly 6 hours. And by the end, the mystery had become far bigger than anyone imagined. According to Wade, 18 years earlier, Crescent Lake had become the center of a private recovery operation. Nothing illegal, at least not initially. A severe storm years before had triggered landslides throughout portions of the Cascade Mountains. Among the debris, workers discovered evidence suggesting old industrial waste had been dumped in remote areas decades earlier. The state quietly hired contractors to locate and remove contaminated material before it could reach local water systems. One of those contractors was Cascade Recovery Services, the company in the photographs, the company linked to the missing boat, the company connected to the hidden hatch. Their operations centered around Crescent Lake, specifically the abandoned warehouse near the northern shore, the underground structure beneath. The hatch had served as secure storage for recovered materials. Everything sounded legitimate, reasonable, boring even, until Dana asked the obvious question. What happened to the three men? Wade closed his eyes. For several seconds he didn't answer. Then he whispered, "They found something." The room went silent. "What?" "I don't know." "You don't know?" "No." Wade leaned forward. "They wouldn't tell anyone." The old captain explained that shortly before their disappearance, the three men had become obsessed with a particular section of the lake. The exact area where Ranger always panicked. The exact area where the sonar anomalies appeared. The exact area where the wrecked boat had surfaced. According to Wade, the men believed something valuable rested beneath the lake. Something unrelated to their cleanup contract. Something hidden. Something worth a fortune. At first, nobody took them seriously. Workers joked about buried treasure. Lost gold. Smugglers! Theories spread throughout the crew. Then the men stopped joking. They became secretive, paranoid, protective, and 2 weeks later they vanished, along with their boat. The official investigation concluded it was an accident. Most people accepted that explanation. Wade never did, because on the night they disappeared, one of the men had visited him, alone, terrified. The man claimed they had found evidence of something buried beneath the lake. Something large, something deliberately hidden. Before Wade could learn more, the man left. The next morning he was gone, along with the others. 18 years passed. The secret remained buried, until Ranger, until the ferry, until the fog. The interview raised as many questions as it answered. If the missing men discovered something valuable, what was it? Why hide it? Why abandon the operation? And why was Ranger reacting now after all these years? The sheriff obtained a warrant to open the underground structure. The following morning, a specialized team arrived. Engineers, state investigators, environmental officials. Everyone expected answers. Nobody expected what they found. The hatch opened with difficulty. Rust groaned. Metal screamed. Then the darkness below revealed itself. A narrow staircase descended underground. Flashlights illuminated concrete walls. Storage rooms. Equipment racks. Old generators. Everything abandoned decades earlier. Dust covered every surface. Nothing appeared unusual at first. Then investigators reached the final chamber. The room was enormous, far larger than expected. Rows of shelves lined the walls. Most stood empty, but one section remained intact. Inside sat dozens of waterproof storage containers, each carefully labeled, each sealed. The team opened them one by one. Records, maps, survey reports, engineering diagrams, thousands of pages. Every document related to the cleanup project. Dana immediately noticed something strange. Many pages were missing. Entire sections had been removed. Someone had intentionally taken specific records, the most important records, which meant someone had returned after the disappearance. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Hours later, investigators discovered another surprise. Hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit sat an old filing cabinet. Locked. The key was gone. The cabinet was forced open. Inside rested a single waterproof tube. Nothing else. Just one tube. The room fell silent. Dana carefully removed the cap. Rolled paper slid out. A map. Large. Detailed. Hand-drawn. Covered with notes. Coordinates. Measurements. Depth markings. And at the center of everything stood a red circle. One location, one point on Crescent Lake. The exact location where Ranger always panicked. The exact location of the sonar anomalies. The exact location of the wrecked boat. Whoever created the map had been studying that section of water intensely for years. Then Ethan noticed something written along the margin. A date, 19 years old. Older than the disappearance itself, meaning the mystery began before the missing men ever vanished. Much earlier, Dana ordered a full underwater search. The operation started 3 days later. Divers, remote vehicles, advanced sonar, everything available. News crews gathered along the shoreline. Residents watched from boats. The entire town seemed obsessed. And through it all, Ranger remained unusually agitated. The closer the search moved toward the target area, the worse he became. On the morning of the dive, Ethan could barely control him. The dog paced, whined, pulled against his leash. Not frightened, urgent, as if time mattered, as if they were running out of it. The first dive produced nothing. The second revealed fragments of metal debris. The third changed everything. A remotely operated underwater vehicle descended through dark water. 100 feet, 120 feet, 150 feet. Then its cameras captured something. The control room erupted into chaos. Technicians crowded around monitors. Investigators rushed forward. Nobody could believe what they were seeing. The object wasn't natural, and it wasn't a boat, at least not entirely. Buried beneath decades of sediment rested a massive structure. Artificial, rectangular, deliberately constructed, much larger than anyone imagined. The dimensions stretched far beyond the missing vessel, far beyond industrial waste, far beyond a simple accident. The structure looked almost like a submerged vault, or bunker. Its walls were steel reinforced. Its roof partially collapsed, and scattered around it lay multiple vehicles. Vehicles the sonar operator had detected earlier. The room went silent, because the discovery immediately created a terrifying new question. If the missing men had found this structure 18 years ago, then what exactly had happened to them? The answer arrived sooner than anyone expected, far sooner. As divers prepared for a closer inspection, one technician reviewing the live video suddenly froze, his face drained of color. "Stop!" Everyone looked at him. "What?" The technician pointed toward the screen. At first nobody understood. Then they zoomed in, and the entire room fell silent, because resting against the partially collapsed wall of the underwater structure was something unmistakable. Not debris, not machinery, not part of the bunker. A human skeleton, still wearing fragments of a work jacket, and stitched onto that jacket, barely visible beneath years underwater, were 4 faded words. Cascade Recovery Services. The remains belonged to one of the missing men. But the most chilling detail wasn't the skeleton. It was where the skeleton was pointing. One arm remained extended, frozen by time, reaching toward a damaged opening in the structure, an opening that appeared to lead even deeper underground, into something nobody had known existed. And at that exact moment, hundreds of feet above the lake, Ranger began howling louder than he ever had before. Ranger's howl echoed across Crescent Lake. Everyone on shore heard it. Divers heard it through communication headsets. Technicians inside the command trailer heard it. Even reporters gathered along the shoreline turned toward the sound. The German Shepherd stood rigid beside Ethan, staring across the water, toward the exact location where investigators had just discovered the skeleton. For months, nobody had understood what Ranger was trying to say. Now everyone knew one thing. The dog had been trying to lead them here. But the biggest question still remained unanswered. What was hidden inside the underwater structure? And what had happened to the missing men? The answer would take another 48 hours to uncover. Because after the discovery of human remains, the operation immediately became a criminal investigation. The lake was secured. State authorities arrived. Forensic divers were brought in. No shortcuts, no guesses. Everything would be documented carefully. Sheriff Dana Reeves understood the stakes. If the skeleton belonged to one of the missing workers, then the official story from 18 years earlier was wrong. The men had not simply vanished. Something had happened. Something significant enough to remain hidden for nearly 2 decades. The next morning, divers entered the water again. Visibility was terrible. Even with powerful lights, the lake floor was covered in thick sediment. Every movement created clouds of debris. Still, the team slowly approached the damaged opening toward which the skeleton appeared to be pointing. The gap was narrow, partially collapsed. Dangerous. Remote cameras entered first. Everyone crowded around the monitors. The footage revealed a tunnel, artificial, engineered, and surprisingly large. The tunnel descended farther beneath the lake bed. The farther cameras traveled, the stranger the discovery became. Concrete walls, steel supports, heavy reinforcement. This was no ordinary storage facility. Someone had invested enormous resources into constructing it, yet no permits existed. No public records, nothing. It was as if the entire project had been erased from history. Then investigators found the first clue. A rusted metal sign bolted to a wall. Most of the lettering had deteriorated. Only fragments remained visible, but one word could still be read. Reservoir. The discovery immediately changed everything. State engineers were consulted. Historical archives were reviewed. Old infrastructure records were examined. And finally, a forgotten piece of Oregon history emerged. Decades before Crescent Lake became a recreational destination, regional planners had considered constructing a secondary water storage reservoir system. The proposal never moved forward publicly. Budget concerns killed the project, at least officially. Yet evidence suggested preliminary construction may have secretly begun before cancellation. The partially completed underground facility beneath the lake appeared connected to that abandoned project, but that still didn't explain the missing men, or the vehicles, or Ranger. The breakthrough came later that afternoon. Deep inside the tunnel network, divers located a sealed chamber. The door had collapsed inward years earlier. Behind it sat several waterproof equipment lockers. Most contained ordinary construction materials. One contained something else, a metal lockbox. Inside the lockbox, investigators found notebooks, personal notebooks. The handwriting belonged to one of the missing workers, the man Wade had spoken with the night before the disappearance. For 18 years, the journals had remained hidden beneath the lake, waiting. The notebooks transformed the entire case. Page by page, investigators reconstructed what had happened. The worker described discovering unusual survey data while conducting cleanup operations. The readings suggested large metallic objects beneath the lake floor. Curious, he and two colleagues began investigating on their own. At first, they believed they had found buried equipment. Instead, they uncovered the forgotten reservoir facility. The structure itself wasn't valuable, but inside it they discovered something unexpected. Dozens of abandoned, government-owned construction, vehicles and equipment units that had never been officially documented. The equipment had been left behind after the project was canceled decades earlier. Removing it would have cost millions. Instead, according to the journal, contractors quietly sealed portions of the facility and walked away. Years passed. Records disappeared. The site was forgotten. Until the workers found it. The discovery wasn't criminal. It wasn't treasure. It wasn't a conspiracy. But it represented something potentially explosive. Evidence of government negligence. Evidence that enormous amounts of public money had been wasted and hidden. The workers believed exposing it could bring media, attention, and financial rewards. So they began collecting evidence, photographs, maps, documents, everything. Then they made a fatal mistake. The final journal entries described increasing tension among the three men. Arguments, distrust, disagreements over what to do next. One wanted to report the discovery immediately. Another wanted to negotiate with attorneys first. The third wanted complete secrecy until they understood its value. The conflict grew worse. Then came the final entry, the entry that solved the mystery. On the night of their disappearance, the men returned to the underwater facility by boat during heavy fog. Their goal was simple: retrieve additional records. Unfortunately, weather conditions deteriorated rapidly. The journal described strong currents generated by an underwater intake system connected to the abandoned reservoir infrastructure. A system nobody realized remained partially functional. The workers entered the tunnel, collected documents, and attempted to leave. Then disaster struck. Part of the aging structure collapsed. One man became trapped. The others tried to rescue him. The boat drifted. Equipment shifted. Debris fell. Within minutes, chaos erupted. The journal ended abruptly. No final explanation. No dramatic confession. Just unfinished sentences. Investigators pieced together the rest through forensic evidence. The collapse damaged sections of the facility. Floodwaters surged through the tunnels. The men became separated. At least one escaped briefly before being swept back toward the structure. Their boat sank nearby. The disaster occurred entirely by accident. A tragic chain of events hidden beneath the lake. No murder. No conspiracy. Just human ambition meeting terrible circumstances. The mystery was finally solved. Almost. One question remained. The question that had started everything. Why had Ranger reacted? Why now? Why the ferry? The answer arrived from an unexpected expert. A canine behavior specialist working with the search and rescue community reviewed months of observations. After studying Ranger's reactions, she noticed a pattern nobody else had recognized. The panic only occurred during foggy crossings. Only when the ferry traveled above the underwater facility. Only when atmospheric conditions were certain. Specifically dense cold fog. The explanation was surprisingly simple. The abandoned reservoir structure contained large hollow chambers. Changes in water pressure, temperature, and ferry vibrations occasionally produced low-frequency acoustic resonance. Essentially, the underwater chambers acted like giant hidden instruments. Most humans couldn't hear the sounds clearly, but dogs could. Especially highly trained working dogs. Ranger had been detecting those frequencies for months. The strange metallic clang passengers occasionally heard. It came from loose structural components vibrating deep below the lake. The resonance intensified during fog because of temperature inversions, affecting sound transmission across the water. To humans, it was subtle. To Ranger, it was overwhelming. Even painful, but there was more. Search and rescue dogs are trained to associate unusual scents, sounds, and environmental cues with hidden locations and trapped victims. Every time Ranger crossed above the facility, he detected the acoustic anomalies. His instincts told him something significant existed below, something hidden, something that demanded attention. He wasn't afraid of the lake. He was trying to alert everyone, again. And again, and again, the same way he would alert handlers to a trapped hiker beneath rubble. For months, nobody understood. But Ranger never stopped trying. The news spread quickly. National outlets covered the story. The forgotten reservoir, the missing workers, the underwater discovery, and especially Ranger. People across America became fascinated by the German Shepherd, who refused to ignore what humans missed. Several months later, recovery teams successfully retrieved the remains of all 3 missing workers. Their families finally received answers after nearly 2 decades. Funerals were held. Questions were laid to rest. Closure arrived where uncertainty had lived for 18 years. As for Wade Holloway, the old ferry captain attended every service. He spent years blaming himself for not pushing harder after the disappearance. Years wondering whether he could have done something differently. The investigation cleared him of wrongdoing. But guilt doesn't disappear because a report says it should. Still, the truth helped. For the first time in nearly 20 years, he no longer carried the burden alone. The following spring, fog once again rolled across Crescent Lake. Tourists returned. Fishing boats crossed the water. Life moved forward. One quiet morning, Ethan boarded the ferry with Ranger. Just the 2 of them. The same route, the same lake, the same stretch of water. As the ferry entered the fog, Ethan watched his partner carefully. Passengers watched too. Many recognized the famous dog. Everyone waited. The ferry moved above the location where the mystery had begun. For a moment, Ranger stood silently, listening. The lake remained calm. The hidden chambers below had been stabilized during recovery operations. The strange resonance no longer existed. No metallic clang. No painful frequencies. No warning signals. Ranger slowly looked toward the water. His ears twitched. Then he sat beside Ethan, relaxed, peaceful. The first completely calm crossing in months. Ethan smiled and scratched behind his ears. "Good job, buddy." Ranger leaned against him. The fog drifted across the lake, soft and silent. Ahead, sunlight began breaking through the clouds, and for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing hidden beneath the mist. Only water, only mountains, only the truth. The mystery that had haunted Crescent Lake for 18 years was finally over, and the dog who refused to stop warning people had finally been heard.